Welcome to Quarantine Zone, a podcast for HBO's The Last of Us. We are your hosts, Andrew Sorsini,
Dwayne D,
and Tosin Anafawakin.
We just watched the 4th episode of The Last of Us, entitled Please Hold to My Hand. We assume you have as well. Total spoilers ahead. Let's dive into the after talk, but first, here are some online spots where you can get in contact with us. You can write to us or email us a voice memo at quarantinezonepod@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at QZPod. Add us on iTunes. Like us, please leave us a review. That's how we get noticed. All right, this episode is written by Craig Mazin and directed by Jeremy Webb, who has previously directed episodes of Umbrella Academy and Masters of Sex. I've seen both of those shows. They're great. All right, Dwayne, why don't you start us off with a recap of tonight's episode?
All right, a lot goes on, so here we go. After this, we'll get into it. But we start off in a gas station. Ellie is practicing with her gun while Joe scouts gasoline. The two bond as they journey. They camp one night in the woods where Joel mentions how dangerous other humans are. We learn that infected are rarely in remote places like the woods. We also learn that Joe's brother Tommy liked to join causes like the U.S. Army and eventually the Fireflies, the resistance to Fedra, the de facto government of the quarantine zones. After some time, the two reach Kansas City, where the highway, I-70, is blocked with an abandoned vehicle, a bunch of them. Joel notices that behind the blocked vehicles, it's quite clear, a sign of intention. Joel decides to head up the off-ramp through the city and back onto the highway after the blockage. But once in the city, they lose their bearings and become lost. Ellie notices that the quarantine zone seems abandoned, and almost immediately, they're attacked by an armed group. Bill's truck crashes into an abandoned laundromat and is disabled. At Joel's direction, Ellie hides, while Joe is under fire by bandits. When Ellie realizes that Joel's in distress, she uses her gun to disable the attacker. Joel takes the gun from Ellie and uses a knife to finish off the young man. We learn the group is well supplied, that they overthrew Fedra in the area. A ringleader named Kathleen interrogates a man named Dr. Edelstein about others who collaborated with Fedra, eventually killing Edelstein, while believing that the man Joel killed died due to Fedra or these collaborators. Joel and Ellie find some shelter and go to bed for the night. They're in decent spirits despite everything that's going on, but they awaken to find themselves captured by people on the run from the very same freedom fighters that Kathleen is leading. And that's it. It's kind of a cliffhanger to be continued episode.
Yeah, and not too complicated of an episode. Dwayne, what were your initial impressions of this episode?
It was the first episode that didn't have a cold open that took place out of time with the rest of the series. And I think they kind of warmed us up. Like, we know the setting. We don't need any more of that. And I felt you got some real bonding going on between the two main characters. You know, they're not quite, buddy cops, but they've begun to come to an understanding. I think the use of the pun book was done super well, especially that last pun before bedtime. And I really like the dynamic that's going on. So I was pretty impressed. At first, I was also very nervous about the whole thing because whenever you've got an adaptation, they throw things for a loop, and here they did that with Kathleen, and I was like, uh-oh. So I was right. I was sitting there, but yeah, it was good.
Tosin, how about yourself? What were your initial impressions of this episode?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I felt that it really played to the game and the sort of plot direction and even the plot direction as well as the actual direction of the game in terms of the events, in terms of how things were shot and positioned, even in terms of the lines that were said that were sort of exact replicas of the game. And I think they managed to do it well and do it in a manner that increased the intensity and also made you feel connected to the characters. So it didn't seem out of place. It seemed like it sort of naturally fit. But yeah, it was a good reminder of the game, and I think they added a little bit of their own flair in there to try and make a little bit more sense of some of the antagonists that you see while they're kind of explained in the game as just, these outsiders who, have kind of turned their back on society and are kind of living a more wild life in this retelling, they give them more purpose and more direction, which is kind of nice. What about yourself, Andy? What did you think?
I thought this was a like a solid, like, middle of the season episode. I am reluctant to use the pejorative filler, because this is not filler. But there was it's funny, coming off of the last week's episode. It's a builder. It's a builder. Yes. I think, if I'm being completely honest, a little anticlimactic after the Bill and Frank episode, which is going to be hard to top. So nothing incredibly groundbreaking, but I feel like it was necessary exposition for the rest of the season. It's good connective tissue. We need to find out about these raiders. We need to find out about this couple. Apparently, I mean, I know because I played the game, but apparently, father and son on the run. Who ambush Joel and Ellie the next morning at the end of the episode. So I think it's a good connective tissue episode. Shall we get into the specific details of this episode? What I really liked about this episode, that I have to say, having played the game, is this episode humanizes the faction of raiders that exist in the game, but in the game they're more like this faceless enemy that are chasing Joel and Ellie. And when Joel and Ellie take them out, one by one, we don't have a lot of sympathy for them because they're the antagonists, and their characters aren't built up really at all. You don't get to get the dimensionality of their characters. But in this episode, they give them a leader in Kathleen and her Lieutenant Perry. So we get to know these people as human beings, and there's more of a dimensionality to them. And they're not even really raiders, right? Like, they're the people that go after them are certainly like, hey, give us your stuff, whatever. But it's like they're in service to a greater cause, and that greater cause is freedom from Phaedra, which doesn't look like the Fireflies, right? Like, so the Fireflies have their own resistance to Phaedra and what's going on. These people are, let's call them independent, unaffiliated, but they're kind of going. They've had their revolution. They've taken Phaedra down. Yes, which is kind of amazing in itself, right? You have a group of people who can take out the Kansas City Phaedra. That's pretty amazing. Yeah, it's and then you get someone like Kathleen, who's, she's human. She wants revenge for what happened to her brother. Sure. Definitely frightening, though, because the fact that she was able to so cold-heartedly take out the doctor who delivered her. Right. And a doctor who's trained in the before times, which is super rare in a 20-year post-apocalyptic space. The fact that she took him out means that she doesn't, they're going to be women who are pregnant. He's an obstetrics guy, right? And she's like, she doesn't care about any of that. She just takes him out. So she is, she's very dangerous because she's acting on a kind of, fear, anger, to the exclusion of reason. So she's like, find him and kill him.
There's a question on whether, there is some reason. She did ask if they could use doctor, right?
In a post-apocalyptic world, if you have a doctor trained beforehand, whether you like him or not, whatever he's done or not, unless he is like, really scared of evil, like he's doing experiments on people or shit. Like, you lock them up and you force them to do the work on people when they need, like, medical attention. They just got through a revolution. Right. Medical attention matters.
For her, she had some people who needed medical attention. She asked if they could be saved. She said they had a doctor. And when she realized they couldn't be saved, she was like, well, he's no longer necessary.
That's what I'm saying. That's bullshit. She's bullshit.
Well, I mean,
Yes.
maybe she's not looking in the long term, but she still thinks that the doctor's actions has led to the death of people that she cared, and she also realizes in this moment the doctor has not done nothing to save other people that she cares for. These are more people that she cares for that have also been lost. So in her mind, he's not useful and hasn't.
I'm not feeling sympathetic for Kathleen. You're not going to get me.
Well, I'm not saying feel sympathetic, but I'm just saying that I don't know that I feel that she's as cold-hearted as led to be. That's my only point.
Here's my take on the situation is that I think the point of that particular scene was to show that Kathleen, while her intention is to be a fair leader, she's clearly blindly obsessed with the idea of retribution. You know,
she's got an agenda about retribution, and it comes to the exclusion of everything else. So she's not thinking, oh no, we might need a doctor for like the children or whatever.
Right.
She's like,
right.
Like one of my people got hurt. Now it's time to hurt you. That kind of thing.
Right. If you can't save this person, then you are of no use to me. Essentially. Yeah. So it's she's got blinders on, and
not only that, she's enabled. So if she's like, open the cell, and she shoots the doctor.
Yeah.
And you would think that the dude who opened the cell knew that was like a doctor. So unless they're like got a ton of doctors, you'd think he'd have some objection to the fact that she killed a pre-apocalyptic doctor. But he's like, you don't hear a thing from him, you know? You don't see Perry, her second in command. You don't see him saying, I heard you killed the doctor.
Well, you see where they go to Henry and Sam's place, that Perry is concerned about her blind obsession about retribution. You know, you see it in the look on his face. So you see for sure that Perry is starting to part with Kathleen's decisions over.
So there's daylight between them, but not enough. And then, you know, she basically sees, they see whatever's bubbling up under the surface.
Yeah, yeah.
And
whatever that
she's
is.
Like, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Like, there's no there. Kathleen is just dangerous.
She's dangerous. But you know, I love the fact that they paint her out, that they flesh out this character so that it's not just a faceless
not a
force.
Twisting danger. She's a She's a person who's hurt, who wants to, you know, hurt people back. So the fact that, and also she sees, what is that phrase? Like if all you have is a hammer, you see everything as a nail.
Exactly.
So she sees the death of Brian. That must have been Henry, even though clearly it wasn't Henry. We know it's not Henry.
Right.
But she sees everything as a link back to the Fedra that is trying to, like, you know, the remnants of Fedra or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other things from going back a little bit chronologically. The joke book, that's clearly something that's in the game, and that it feels like that's sort of like in the game. It feels like an extra thing, maybe just to flesh out Ellie's character, to give her a bit of levity, and also as the player to sort of kill time while you're going through the motions of picking up things and moving things around. You know, it's like a time filler. But I love the fact that they use this joke book in the from the game in the show, because part of it is that you can see it helps to demonstrate the Joel and Ellie's relationship starting to warm up. You know, that they're starting to get closer to each other, and his walls of resistance are breaking down. You know, and I think in the beginning of this episode, he refers to her as cargo.
Yep.
And by the end of the episode, you could see how much he is starting to care for her. And I think that
I definitely think that you know, especially with the joke book, I think it was a nice touch. To be honest, I've been waiting for the joke book because that was always one of my favorite parts of the game, especially how you could get extra jokes if you kind of went through certain sequences. You could get her to tell more jokes, and so I'm the type of person who loves puns and memes and such. But I thought it was really interesting that the first introduction to the joke book was really just after Ellie is pointing a gun at herself in the mirror, right? So you have this really sort of dark, dangerous scene that's really juxtaposed by a little bit of levity, and it makes you wonder, like, you know, she mentions later on that she's killed someone, and
she's hurt somebody.
She's hurt someone. She's done it before,
right?
And it makes you kind of try and figure out, like, what exactly is going on there. Is this all symbolic? Her pointing a gun at herself, like her, like, not necessarily like taking aim at herself because of some things she's done in the past, or is this also just more like, or is it also that sort of darker side where she, you know, where she's locked and loaded and ready to kind of do anything to save herself and potentially him.
So I really love that scene in the beginning, the cold open, where she's pointing the gun at herself in the mirror. It reminded me of Taxi Driver. If any of you have seen that.
Oh yeah.
It to me, it felt like a direct homage. Like, you looking at me, all that stuff. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It just reminded me of this kind of theme that I saw in this episode, which is that she's still a kid, right? So she does the taxi driver thing, and then she is holding the gun, and she says, pew, pew, right?
right.
Which is what my 4-year-old says whenever he sees, like, the Transformers, right? He's like, pew, 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 pew. And you have to wonder, because the whole pew, pew thing is, like, kind of tied to, like, G.I. Joe, Transformers, all these kind of innocuous,
Sure. Gunplay.
Gunplay in cartoons where, like, you know, the gunplay actually had no consequences. That's like a very kid thing. So she's still a kid.
Sure.
The gun feels as much a toy as it is a tool. Like, clearly she knows how to use it on some level. It's almost as if she's seen a lot of movies. But we find out that Fedra taught her how to use it a little bit. And then there's other things where she's still a kid, right? She gets a lot out of those puns in ways that, like, only a teenager would. She says stuff like, "I'm not even tired," and then falls asleep. And that's exactly what my 15-year-old niece did this weekend. And my 2-year-old does too. So my 3-year-old. And then also she's still a kid because Joel says as much regarding her shooting Brian. She shoots Brian, and the first thing she does is, like, try to cover up her tears when she's alone, and then again when Joel brings it up, she's, like, trying not to feel it. Now, adults cry when they hurt people too. There's no doubt. But the way she reacts is like someone who's not emotionally prepared, and that's kind of the whole essence of childhood, right? Not being emotionally prepared for whatever's going on. So I love the fact that she's kind of still a kid, and that thing where she's, like, pointing the gun at the mirror and everything. I think Tosin, you're right. It was a kind of iconic. It was a get to know Ellie kind of moment. So I like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that she is kind of a kid and trying to be more than that, and she asks Joel, basically, does it get better as you grow older?
Right. Do
you get more comfortable with this kind of world that we're in? And I guess that is still to be determined. It sounds like from Joel's perspective, no. Everyone is dreaming, saving the world is a delusion. But Ellie sort of calls out his hypocrisy there. It's just that he hasn't accepted it yet, right? In the beginning of the episode, she's cargo to him. Yeah. But as he starts laughing and smiling and trusting her, you don't trust cargo with a gun, right?
Right.
So I think she's become more than that for him.
Yeah.
Also, I
think the jury's out for him. I think he's like, he does see her as more than cargo. I think part of the reason he calls her cargo might be that he doesn't want her to feel as if he wants her to stay professional, so to speak. He wants the stratification of their status in order to do things like say, you got to go hide, you got to go do this, right? He needs her to listen to him. And so he has to kind of assert himself as separate, as kind of a leader, instead of simply a peer or the father. I think we all think that he'll become on some level. So I don't know that I know he said she's cargo. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I trust him as an honest narrator of his feelings when he called her cargo. I kind of feel like it's kind of like in the Matrix when Neo comes out from seeing the Oracle and she lied to him.
Right.
And Morpheus says, she said what you needed to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think Joel is saying what he thinks Ellie needs to hear in order for Ellie to be at the top of her game.
Right. I think there's an interesting dichotomy between, Ellie trying to grow up quickly and be tough and be aspiring to be like a cold killer, right? Wanting to use a gun, stabbing the infected in the episode before, and thinking that maybe she's trying to emulate the kind of person that Joel is, where on the flip side, Joel just confessed to her that it doesn't get easier. Like the having to do this as a necessity, killing other people, doesn't get easier, and he still has it still bothers him. So
right, which makes sense, right? Because last week we meet Bill, who's he's got the ability to stone cold kill humans, right?
Sure.
He's got the skills and the tactics. He's prepped enough. He focused on the idea that when the world went to shit, he was actually happy to see people die. And yet he's an emotional being who had feelings, obviously was very sensitive in certain ways.
Right. And
they kind of put forth the foundation that just because you're a man in an action scenario and you got to kill people, it doesn't mean that you're not a thinking, feeling human being. Right. And I think that discussion about Bill actually makes it more realistic, or it's good foundation for understanding the complexity of Joel, who's also a badass, right? The whole bond between Bill and Joel, where they're badassery.
Right.
And Joel's basically saying, yeah, I mean, I'm admittedly I'm a badass. I just stuck a knife through someone's ribs so they suffocated to death quietly so we could get away. Mm-hmm. The person was defenseless, but it wasn't easy. It cost me something. But in the attempt to find my brother, to make good for Tess, and by getting you to him and the Fireflies, I'll pay that cost. But it is a cost.
Let's talk about that moment for a second, because I was curious about that. I was interested in interrogating that moment. So Brian, this is the attacking raider that Ellie shoots. When he's lying there and he can't feel his legs because he's been shot, he seems genuinely remorseful and repentant, and he's more than willing to give up and let Joel and Ellie go. But then Joel sends Ellie away, and Joel kills him anyway. You're saying that you think,
it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, you're saying you think that he did that so that he doesn't call out and alert the other raiders. I'll call them raiders for lack of a better community term for them.
They're freedom fighters.
Sure.
Yeah. So he doesn't. Well, the rest of his faction, right? He's for the last 10 minutes he was being shot at by these guys. He takes one down. The other one says, "I'm gonna kill you," kind of like just in the video game. And then he repositions himself, takes the other one down, and then he doesn't see
Brian.
Joel get in there, and not Joel, Brian get in there, and Brian almost kills him.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is, what we know for certain, I think what Joel knew for certain, is that Brian was desperate. Once Brian was shot, he was desperate. But how much of his desperation was translating into actions that were genuine, or actions that were simply a desperate person trying to stay alive, was unclear. So he pulls out the knife and he throws it. And that's clearly an act of hey, I'm really sorry, whatever. But if you're Joel and your goal is to keep Ellie safe, to deliver her, mm-hmm. you can't trust him, because if he heard the slightest thing from one of his colleagues coming around hey, Brian, you okay? What was Brian going to do? He was going to scream, hey, help me over here, whatever. So he had to shut him up. And that's the thing. It's I know you're scared, dude. And I know you might not be a threat to me anymore, but physically at least, but you're still a threat to me in my mission. So you have to go, right? Anyone who knows Buffy sees Giles killing Ben at the end of season 5 simply because he could become Glory again, and you're like, that sucks, but you see why, right?
No, I mean, I definitely agree there. I think the biggest thing is trust, right? So throughout the series, we know that Joel doesn't really trust anyone, and he's maybe starting to trust Ellie a bit, given that he gave her the gun back. But we know that's kind of one of his as him being sort of the thug and the overarching sort of the overarching heavy in the game or in this series. Like, we know that he has sort of very simplistic drives, and those simplistic drives are really keeping her safe. And given that he doesn't trust anyone, no one, and given the things he's seen, right? He admitted that he once was in that position of being sort of a raider or a freedom fighter, and they did similar things. So he already has this perception of who these individuals are. He has this perception of how the world has changed. He has a perception of a guy, military guy, being ordered to shoot him and his daughter. And so those things weigh on him, and they are, I think they're ultimately like cornerstones that cause him to be who he is. So, like, it wasn't surprising that the guy had to go.
He had
pretty
to go.
Brutal, though, based off of his lines and his actions, based off of some of the real world stuff that we saw.
Yeah,
it's very chilling. So
I wonder how a choice like that will affect Ellie. Knowing that Joel essentially cold-heartedly killed Brian after begging for mercy.
Well, it all depends. On some level, we don't know if Ellie was shooting for the kill with Brian, and she just didn't finish him herself, or if she was like, well, I'll shoot him and he'll stop and then we'll go. We don't know where she was at. She doesn't have the skills to do a clean kill. Kind of like,
sure.
If you watch nature documentaries, you'll see like a mama cheetah, and she'll bring a rabbit around or something, or she'll lead her cubs to this rabbit, and the cubs will stalk the rabbit and like wound it, but they don't know how to like finish it off, and then she's got to finish it off. It kind of almost felt like that. Like, Ellie knew that she had to do what she had to do with Brian, because Brian was going to kill Joel, and Joel was, her person right now. And, but she just didn't know quite how to do it. So Brian ended up, suffering. He couldn't feel his legs. He was scared. Who knows if he was bleeding out. And Joel had to finish the job, so to speak. So it just kind of felt like, we're going to talk about Lone Wolf and Cub. It's one of those things as well. So I don't know. I have no sympathy for Brian, to be honest. I'm like, Brian, you got to go.
Yeah. I don't know that I'd be able to make the same decision into the same circumstances, but I guess then, I would suffer the consequences if so.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, I know I don't have the skill set to slit somebody's, lungs with a knife through the ribs. I don't know how to do that. But I also know that, Brian had no hesitation. He's like, you killed my friend. Yeah, I'm going to do whatever to you. Right. And Joe's like thinking about that when he's taking out Brian, as well as everything else that we've discussed.
I really dug a lot of the, game callbacks.
Yeah.
We had the sometimes on the simplistic side, we had Ellie moving boxes and stuff behind the doors. She goes through small crawl spaces that she can only fit in. There's the whole scene with Ellie in the back seat of the car going looking through the magazine, which is, I think it might be word for word what was in the game.
I think it was word for word from the game. Kind of amazing.
Yeah, especially.
I mean, the game has some great moments like that. Yeah, so I'm glad they just took them.
Yeah, and keep in mind that's Bill's car, so that's also
right,
another.
Right.
Real talk, right? Like, that's one of the things we learned. Like, Bill was, he was an archetype of like, of like the sort of heroic man who happens to be a homosexual, and he and Frank, it was so romantic, and like, everything was like classy, right? With that episode last week, everything about them was classy.
Yep.
And then you're like, Bill was spanking it in the back of his truck. Some magazine.
But I mean, I
and
think
Ellie's like, all right, these pages stuck together because she knows that it's not just that Bill was spanking it. It's that Ellie knows that Bill spanked it. So the idea that she's like, why are these pages stuck together, but she's joking, is another indication of her like her worldliness. She hasn't been anywhere. She hasn't seen much, but she's worldly enough to have hurt somebody, she confesses, and to know what a porno magazine is. And it's another hint about her own sexuality. A young teenager seeing like pictures of hot bodies of naked men. A lot of heterosexual girls would at least like peruse the magazine, but she's not interested because we know what Ellie's about. You know what I mean? And so she's like, I'm happy to throw this out, out the window. So that was also interesting to me. But like this idea that like for all of the regality afforded Frank and Bill, the reality of Frank and Bill, of at least Bill, is that like, yeah, there's a nudie magazine, and I'm digging it because I'm a man's man.
Right. They have human needs like anybody else. Yeah.
Yep. And in the game, this was all subtle, or at least more subtle than the last episode we had. So it's also a good note for those folks who maybe played the game, but maybe they didn't catch it. That this stuff was there. Now, I think one of the things that I also find kind of funny is as Joel and Ellie are driving by like the gas station. You see that you see a sign for Arby's, which also a reference to the last episode where Bill said, where he's like a restaurant that gives free handouts, which clearly is not the case, but maybe it was when a society went down.
Yeah, there's an Arby's sponsorship. This definitely like an Arby's
feels like it, right?
in this show. Yeah,
and totally. Doritos as well too. I saw that. And then there's Love's gas station, but one of the things you notice is there's no O or V in the Love, kind of showing you that it's no longer complete, right? Things have changed. Life is different. Even the song on the radio, the song on the cassette tape that they're playing, which is the Hank Williams song, around that time, a little bit later than that, he says, "Forsaken, forgotten, without any love." So that's really on the nose with everything that you're seeing, hearing, experiencing. Right. Even the color, right? The color palette. I know we talk about technical aspects later, but you notice this kind of bright blue car, which is insular, which keeps both Joel and Ellie together and safe for part of the journey, while everything else is dark, bleak, corroded, rusted away, and of an ancient time. So
let me just jump on what you just said. So the car that stands out was a great. The choice was great because blue isn't something that we see in nature that often. It's also like smooth and cute, and everything else is rough. But what I do like is how we keep on seeing how nature's reasserted itself, right? So in the gas station, we meet Ellie when she's playing with the gun, and there's like basically weeds and everything growing through the gas station. When she gets out, the cars around her, the cars like Joel's dealing with the siphon with, they're basically not only rusted out, but there's growth out of them, right? We see it with bison were nearly extinct.
Yeah.
Less than 30 years ago, 50 years ago rather, and now they're just casually grazing on the grass all over the place, right? They don't have a care in the world. Yeah. And so the buffalo are roaming once again. The roads are covered in green growth. So I was surprised at how many roads were clear for them to drive, given the end of the apocalypse. But it has been 20 years, and Fedra is still a force. So Fedra could have cleared those roads. That's the thing that I thought about.
Could be.
But when you look at the roads, they're covered in grass is cropping up between them. Vines are there.
Right.
And we think of roads as sort of like sterile. But again, when you don't have the maintenance of the infrastructure, you see, all that nature reasserting itself. And then you see the whole thing where the train was on the bridge and the bridge had collapsed. Like what Tosin said with the loves, the sign, like the vowels had fallen out. Just one of those things. Yeah. So I love seeing the way they're building this world. And then we learn a couple things about the world, right? So obviously, as is the case in almost every single post-apocalyptic setting, the disease or the infected are definitely dangerous, but people are more dangerous. And Joel goes and says that. Yeah. But he also lets us know that the infected are usually not very remote, right? You don't see them in places like the woods, which kind of makes sense because the infected are looking for other beings to infect.
Right.
And that kind of density happens in places like cities. Whereas when you've got, far-flung places like the forest, there's not a lot there for the cordyceps to reinfect. So it was kind of a break. We didn't really see, with the exception of like the ground moving, we didn't see the infected at all this episode, right? And that was pretty powerful. The idea that all the conflict was happening within the heart of Joel, in the heart of Ellie, and then again in Kansas City, without the real need to sort of show we are the face of like the cornerstone challenge of the whole entire series, which is these infected people, the reason why Ellie is important. So that was pretty cool.
On that note, also I noticed that as they're driving down the highway, they first pass like a fleet of FedEx trucks, and in current day, FedEx trucks are ubiquitous because it's like a huge logistic infrastructure, and to see them all abandoned tells you how long it's been since they were of utility. But then they also passed scores of abandoned military vehicles. So it's like we've seen like two whole eras of civilization pass. We've seen the era of peaceful civilization with the FedEx trucks, and then it's been so long even that the military presence is now pretty much gone and obsolete from that area.
Yeah, it was also interesting because Joel mentioned that she'd see it, and I thought, he's like, "Oh, you're going to see tanks, choppers." She's like, "I want to see a tank." He's like, "Yeah, you'll see tanks, choppers, all of it." And I thought that meant that as they got closer to Wyoming, they'd see these things because there's more Federal presence out west.
And there should have been.
Right. But instead, it's like one of these expectations that's been flipped the way so many things have been flipped in the show. They set up an expectation, and basically she gets to see them as decrepit and falling apart. And he gives us foundation when he's like, they all turned it against the wrong enemy, right? So it's kind of like you're looking at these abandoned military vehicles, this hardware, this ordnance, all this stuff, and it could have been more effective against the common enemy, but instead it was used against the petty enemy of people attacking people in the face of this crazy conflict. And that was to me, it stuck out. I really enjoyed that, and I think on some level, Ellie seeing those incredible weapons of war, these modern marvels brought low by time and vines is also a good thing.
When you call them freedom fighters, it reminded me of one of the vehicles that I saw roll by, which is one of the commandeered military vehicles. And they had spray painted "We the People" on the side.
Yes, that's why I'm calling them freedom. And when I'm calling them freedom fighters, it was it was because I saw that, and it was also because of kind of like Nuremberg kind of style trial that Kathleen was holding with the doctor. It's kind of tongue in cheek though, because they're fighting on some level for their own freedom, and they nominally are fighting for everyone's freedom. But Kathleen still has a pretty, she has a freakish hold on them. So, time will tell if she's going to be, actually a person who's helping people, or if she's just using her power to kind of like institute some sort of like Robespierre level reign of terror on the existing people. We'll have to see. Like, what's everyone else going to say when they find out she killed the doctor?
Right. I mean, I think they're all sort of currently they're caught up in it's only Perry that sees it because he's with her. He's literally, her right-hand man. And everyone else is sort of just caught up in the trying to survive and stay alive.
Yeah, it kind of feels like, in Waterworld, the guys in the Exxon Valdez, like they're just trying to like stay alive, so they don't care what the bigger issues are.
Right.
That's kind of like with the people walking around whereas she's the Dennis Hopper role, but obviously like far more subtle.
Sure. I thought it was interesting that Tommy's got this backstory. Joel talks about Tommy being a joiner, and you can see where he had a history of being idealistic and easily led to a cause to save the world. So an interesting bit of backstory that I don't remember being in the game. Might have been, but it's interesting to get that fleshing out of his character in
I love that too, because it ties in with Ellie being like, well, if you don't want to save things, like, what's the point?
Right.
And Joel doesn't really have an answer for her. Even though at the end of the day, the whole point is that he's going to save her, like, save the world. Right? Save anyone you can. And he's like, I don't do that. But yet he's doing that. So that was good irony.
Yeah. Like, obviously, I think Joel considers that quality about Tommy to be a liability, and Bill and Tess all feel like there's got to be some point to save who you can save, and Joel isn't there yet. So this is just another sort of step.
Well, it's weird because on some level he is there about his brother, but he doesn't see it. It's like this huge irony of situation. He is a saver, but he doesn't see himself as a saver. And everything that he's doing is like he's on this trip to save his brother. And he's during the course of this trip, he's saving Ellie. And if he's successful, he might save humanity. So he's a person who has the missions are there. He's reluctant, an anti-hero, but also he doesn't like to join things. He doesn't want to join with Tess to become like, a married couple or whatever, a kind of, bond that they would have had before. He doesn't want to, join the Firefly. He doesn't like joining things, but he is in some ways the hero that his brother wanted to be.
I think it's interesting that Ellie has never had coffee. So obviously she was born post Starbucks, but has an awareness of Starbucks, I guess, from probably all the abandoned
power of branding, right?
Yeah.
And Starbucks was ubiquitous.
Oh yeah.
Especially in like the early 2000s, Starbucks was like you could go across the street from a Starbucks and be in another Starbucks.
Exactly.
Right. So she's like, all those Starbucks, they sold this stuff. And I like how Joel basically said, yes, but it was fresher then, so it tasted better.
Right.
And Bill had to scrounge stuff up. There's like these little like nuggets of I don't want to call it hard science fiction or anything, but
world building.
Well, it's reality world building, right? Yeah. So like you kind of he tries to explain the siphon and how gas breaks down. Most, you watch something like The Walking Dead, and I don't want to dog on The Walking Dead. I think there's lots of value to it. It's like 9 years later and they're still using gas.
Uh-huh.
It hasn't, they're like, oh, I siphoned some gas out of the car. Let's go. There's no discussion about it breaking down. There's no discussion about the coffee being less fresh. There's no discussion about any of that kind of like real world practical stuff. And in this show, they're showing you how not easy it is to have some of these modern conveniences, which I thought was pretty interesting. I also think it was interesting that there was gas to siphon after 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, that seems maybe stretching credulity a little bit because gas does go bad.
Right. I mean, and he mentioned it like it's its potency. It's what's it called? It's
efficacy.
Its energy density is far less. So it's turning into water, which is important. The thing that's important to realize is that, for instance, and this is kind of geeky, but if you're looking at like an electric car, for instance, like a Tesla Model X, it's got a 100 kilowatt hour battery, right? That's a lot of energy. That can power your house for days. But when you put gas into a car, you're not dealing with kilowatts. You're dealing with megawatts of energy. So gas can lose a significant amount of its potency and still be able to get the car going.
Sure.
Because cars are just that inefficient. Like, gas cars are just that. They're using megawatts of energy to do what kilowatts could be if they were more efficient. So I do believe that there could be gas out there that's not good. It's just hard to believe that every car hasn't been siphoned by survivors. Right.
I think that it's interesting that Joel, by the end of this episode, Joel doesn't answer Ellie if he'd killed innocent people. Ellie asked if he killed innocent people, which we have to assume has to be yes or a more complex answer is that nobody is innocent, really.
I think it's even deeper than that. I think it's on some level he thinks he got Sarah killed and she was innocent.
But also, by the end of the episode, Ellie doesn't tell Joel who she had killed before. He asks her directly.
And he's fine with that, yeah.
Yeah.
I also think it was great that he was fine with the fact, okay, she pulls out the gun. He's like, don't have a gun. And she shoots the guy in the back, and he takes the gun from her. But there isn't a moment where he dresses her down, which is another thing I was expecting, and that got flipped on. I got my head flipped on me again. This idea that what are you doing with the gun? You don't know how to use it, whatever. He sees the value. He sees that she got one. He is like, all right, how do you? And basically he's like, okay, fine, you saved my life. How do you hold it? Let's fix what's broken with how you're using the gun, as opposed to what I as a father would do and freak out about the use of a gun by a small person. So I think that by understanding, she's a kid, but she's a kid in this world.
Yeah,
she needs to protect herself. And she hurt somebody in the past. I don't need to cloud her mind by having her dredge up that trauma for the sake of my curiosity.
Sure.
Just I don't need to cloud her mind with the idea that we're buddy cops now. No, I'm going to call you Cargo, and you're going to focus on us getting out of here. And I also think his confidence in himself, we will get through this. That's been said a few times now, and it's it may not be pretty. It may cost other people's lives, but we're going to get through this. And I think that was, and that's just a thing that just reminds you that he's willing to take people down to fulfill his goals. And regardless of have you killed innocents? He's I don't think it matters if I get what I want. And what I want is not some terrible thing. I'm not trying to build an empire, but I do have to get to see my brother. And if I have to kill people to do it, then that's fine. So yeah, I don't know. I feel some nice complex character building this episode, but it also some moments that made me smile. There was this moment where she's like, "What am I eating?" He's like, "That's 20-year-old Chef Boyardee ravioli."
Right.
And she's like, "That guy was good."
Yeah. And he agrees.
And then on top of that, he goes, "I actually agree."
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing that made me smile to myself was
yeah.
I know a lot of people be like, "Oh, don't eat Chef Boyardee, gross, whatever." But man, did I love me some Chef Boyardee when I was a little kid. Yeah. And I remember it fondly. Yeah. My kids can't stand it. But I remember being like, oh, yeah.
Sure.
Spaghetti and meatballs from Chef Boyardee? I could put that away.
Our tastes get more sophisticated as we grow older. And luckily for your kids, they already have a father who has introduced them to pretty sophisticated tastes as they're growing up. So they don't really have the opportunity for
more salt and old meat in a can.
Trash food.
Right. Well, the thing is, if you're on the go, obviously anything in a can is good. That's part of the whole post-apocalyptic genre.
For sure.
You find something in a can.
20 years old.
Right. I mean, on some level, is it safe to eat 20-year-old canned meat? On another level, clearly somebody figured that out several years ago that it was pretty okay.
Yeah.
And they're eating it like it's no problem. So, there's that. And then you've got Henry and his kid. The evidence that they were there is also cans. Cans have to be pretty exciting things to find in a post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the fact that they were eating the Chef Boyardee was just wonderful. It's possible to think that in a world that Fedra runs, there are new canned goods, that they have canning operations, facilities, whatever. But the Chef Boyardee line really got me going. I was like, it just brought me into it as a more than just a person looking at it to see what's going on, but as a thinking, feeling, emotional viewer. I'm like, yeah, it is good. Get that Chef Boyardee going.
Yeah. Simple pleasures for Ellie. All right, let's talk about some of the technical aspects. This is behind the scenes elements that we enjoyed about this episode: music, acting, visual effects, etc. Which, by the way, the visual effects on this show have just been amazing. I mean, when you consider they shot all of this in Calgary, and Calgary is doubling for, Kansas City and Boston and all of these other places. The stuff that they're doing with like the digital backgrounds are just phenomenal. Or like that overhead shot when they're driving over the river and you see all the abandoned ships and boats in the river.
Yeah.
Just amazing. Just
talk to me about that. What's amazing about it?
Well, I mean, it's hard to. I'm just impressed with the ability to realistically translate that stuff into, because it didn't look, it didn't look false at all. It looked authentic.
That's true.
And
I did look at that. I looked at that stuff and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And a person like me who's not like chasing down visual effects or like how they do that stuff. If I'm like, oh, that's interesting, then that means that they won, right?
Right. I mean, it's easy to do that stuff when you have a feature film budget, but to accomplish that on a TV budget, I mean, HBO is clearly throwing the cash in on this show. And whatever they're, not paying, whatever's not the overhead to the actors and the live location sets and everything, they're really pouring the rest of it into the visual effects, and it's the kind of visual effects that people take for granted because they're not showing.
It's not like She-Hulk.
Right. So there's that. Also, I wanted to note that the actor who plays Perry is Jeffrey Pierce, who is the original voice of Tommy, Joel's brother from the game. So it's nice that they are able to bring these actors back in to play characters, if not the same character that they were playing.
And he was a badass in the show today.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
He was, it wasn't like he was some dude who sits behind a desk and talks into a microphone and pretends to be a badass. Like, he looked pretty badass. Like, I don't want to run into that guy.
Right. Clearly, he's the muscle. If Kathleen is the brains, is the head, Tommy is the muscle. Also,
did you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've noticed throughout the whole series, but this episode in particular, the chemistry between Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey feels really authentic and familiar and friendly. Like, I can tell that either they're incredible actors, which I'm sure they are, but if not, they really do like each other as actors, because they seem to have some great on-screen chemistry, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. I think that they really work well together. I think that was one of the slight concerns given the chemistry we saw with the actress that played his daughter that passed away. She was just, she was amazing. And so you have a high bar to live up to, and I think they're definitely doing it with a unique way, right? It's not a pure father-daughter relationship. It's a father-other relationship, which develops into a sort of daughter relationship, or at least that's what we as the viewer hope actually occurs, but to be seen. By the way, did you guys realize, like, in the initial car scene, how like Ellie starts off in the backseat and then appears in like the front seat?
Right.
I mean, it could have been over time, of course, and that is how it plays out in the game too.
But it's another thing about she's a kid, right? So she's like, this is my second day in a car, and she's like, let's go on the back seat. What's going on in the front seat? Also, those back seats from like that old S10, tiny things, and so she's a small person, and she could get back there comfortably. Maybe she took a nap. Who knows? But yeah, I do like the fact that she's kind of moving around from area to area in there.
Also, metaphorically, she's getting closer.
Oh yeah, look at that. Yeah.
Let's talk about ephemera. These are links and extra textual connections that'll help enhance the enjoyment of this episode. Let's talk about the last episode, the episode 3. So apparently, since episode 3 came out, it's been review bombed. people are deliberately intending to give it a negative review on sites, on review sites. And
there's an ad. It's more than that. There's a campaign to sort of give it, a kind of crowdsourced campaign to give that episode a negative review, so that despite the critical acclaim,
sure,
that it's received, it's trending as a not, less attractive episode of the ones that have come out so far. And if you're not otherwise paying attention, you might be like, oh, I guess I could skip episode 3. And I think that is due to the fact that, it featured
a representation of positive male homosexuality.
Yeah. And people, there's a lot of people, especially in game culture, who may not like that. There's also just this idea that there's a wider culture that's not interested in that being kind of portrayed. And HBO's demographic is usually heterosexual men who, are used to seeing boobs on screen.
Exactly.
So you can see that there could be a negative reaction to that right there.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing. I think over time, the people running the websites where it got review bombed might adjust things, and
sure.
B, in the fullness of time, I have a feeling that episode is going to stand out as one of the best ones. So
for sure.
I'm not too worried about it, but it's an interesting phenomenon that could happen.
Interesting phenomenon for sure. Dwayne, you linked to a article about that sort of mirrors the backstory in the game and the show, in that our warmer climate overall might drive fungi to be more dangerous to our health.
Yeah. So basically, this comes out of Duke University, and their abstract says that pathogenic fungi like Candida, Aspergillus, and Cryptococcus and others are notorious killers of immune-compromised people. But for the most part, healthy people don't have to worry about them. And the vast majority of the planet's potentially pathogenic fungi don't do well in the heat of our bodies. But that actually may be about to change, because a new study at the Duke University School of Medicine found that raised temperatures cause pathogenic fungus known as Cryptococcus to turn its adaptation responses into overdrive and increases its number of genetic changes, some of which might presumably lead to higher heat resistance and others perhaps sort of greater disease-causing potential. So it's not wild to think that even though the study had not been published when The Last of Us TV show was being produced, that producers could have looked to see that this kind of study was going on.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
The results not published, but the kind of study was going on. They could have talked to people. Hey, you're a fungus expert at Duke. You're a fungus expert anywhere. What do you think is happening here? And then kind of got their premise that way. So it's not like a wild coincidence. They probably are tied to one another, but at the same time, it's a hard science saying that that this is a thing that we do have to think about, and that the consequences of climate change could really be more than just weather emergencies and like drought. It could be our very health due to these these changes in the environment. This link was sent to me by my buddy Urban. Shout out. Thanks, Urban. Urban is the guy I played The Last of Us with.
Nice. And lastly, this weekend, as we're recording, Saturday Night Live had Pedro Pascal as a host, and one of the skits they did was an imagining of HBO tackling the next gritty series based on a video game, and that video game being Mario Kart. And it was pretty good. Actually, I have to say that for SNL skits, this one also looked like it had a huge budget, like HBO level budget on SNL skit material.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of adaptations, didn't you find a link that said something like Hollywood's about to bet big on video games?
Yeah. So this is Rolling Stone, and their headline said that the Last of Us is just the beginning of Hollywood's big video game gamble. And I thought that
That hilarious.
I thought that headline was really kind of self-serving for Rolling Stone because and a bit disingenuous because ever since 1993, when the movie Super Mario Brothers came out, Hollywood has been betting big on video games, and that was a big budget movie for its time, and so the idea that Hollywood is just beginning to gamble on video games is really disingenuous. They've been doing it for years. I think the difference is that they've been gambling for decades, and it has been a losing bet all of this time until The Last of Us. I mean, with a few exceptions, like stuff like
narratively speaking, it's been a losing bet. But obviously, like some movies have made money, like
for sure,
the original Mortal Kombat or whatever,
Tomb Raider.
Yes. There've been 3 or 4 Tomb Raider movies right now.
Yeah. And the Angelina Jolie one is still I think the highest box office video game adaptation in film so far. But other things like
you sure it's not the Phantom Menace?
The Phantom Menace is not based on a video game. No,
isn't it based on the Pod Racer game?
No. But yeah, no. I just thought it was kind of hilarious and a bit disingenuous to that's a clickbait headline as far as I'm concerned.
Right. There's also like a whole bunch of video games that might get adapted.
Right.
That are going to be terrible adaptations.
Right.
Like I think The Last of Us lends itself to this adaptation. We saw we talked about a few other games that are being adapted. But yeah, I feel like there's going to be some terrible video game adaptations out there. So buyer beware.
Yes. I think the secret has always been, even since 1993, is you have to have good narrative material. Like you have to have not just, you can adopt anything as a video game adaptation, but the writing has to be good, in the screenplay stage. And I think that's really the fundamental difference between The Last of Us and the stuff that has come previous is everything else is just not cut the mustard. Like it just misses the mark, from anywhere from a little bit to broadly misses the mark.
I know. These things are not like scarecrows that stand out in their field.
Right. But they are running in their genes. So
exactly. Oh man, I was cracking up. I'd heard it before, but I was cracking up.
The delivery was just delicious. Pardon me. All right, so that is going to do it for this episode of Quarantine Zone. I'm going to go around the table. I'll start with you, Dwayne, and ask, where can people find your work on the internet when you're not talking about The Last of Us?
Check me out on Twitter, twitter.com/DwayneD, and you might be able to find me on Mastodon if I can find myself. Tosin, what about you, Tosin?
You can find me at twitter.com/toast4321, and you can find me on Instagram at, I believe it's currently Toasty4321, as well as Burnt Toast 45. So find various things that I'm working on there. What about yourself, Andy?
You can find me at Mr. Babyman on Instagram and Twitter. Those are my handles there. Also on Facebook as well. As far as our show goes, our Twitter and Facebook, again, are QZ Pod. We're on all major podcast distribution networks. Add us, tell your friends, and join us next week when we cover the 5th episode of The Last of Us entitled Endure and Survive. That's a slogan that I remember from the game.
Right, remember, that one's actually coming out Friday, people.
That one is going to be released Friday on HBO in advance of the Super Bowl. It's Super Bowl weekend next weekend, and they want to get in before all of the ratings, all of the audience share goes over to the Super Bowl. So
we're not going to be recording on Friday. It's going to be your regularly scheduled Monday morning download.
Yes. So until then, please drop us an email, tweet us, leave us a comment on iTunes, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.